Ethan Caldwell was not your ordinary young man. Born into one of the wealthiest families in the city, he had lived a life most people could only dream of, or criticize from afar. From the moment he took his first steps, Ethan's path was paved with gold. His father, Richard Caldwell, wasn't just rich. He was powerful. A billionaire real estate mogul with connections that reached into every corner of the city, Richard knew everyone who mattered, and everyone knew him. For Ethan, growing up meant learning how to leverage those connections. Rules were more like suggestions, and consequences were something that happened to other people. As a child, Ethan attended the best schools, wore designer clothes, and drove luxury cars as soon as he turned 16. But wealth wasn't the only thing that defined him. It was his attitude. He believed the world owed him something simply because of his last name. If someone dared challenge him, all it took was a mention of his father's name to make them back off. Teachers, police officers, even store managers. They all seemed to fold under the weight of the Caldwell reputation. Over time, this pattern became second nature to Ethan. Why bother following rules when you could bend them? Why apologize when no one ever forced you to? But life has a way of catching up with people, even those who think they're untouchable. One Friday night, Ethan found himself at an upscale nightclub downtown, surrounded by flashing lights, loud music, and a crowd eager to impress him. It started innocently enough. He ordered expensive drinks, laughed loudly with friends, and soaked in the admiration of those around him. But as the hours passed, Ethan grew restless. The DJ played a song he didn't like, the bouncer asked him to stop blocking the VIP section, and suddenly, Ethan felt irritated. Used to getting his way, he snapped. What began as a heated argument quickly escalated. When the bouncer refused to let him cut the line for the restroom, Ethan shoved him hard, shouting threats about calling his father. Security arrived within minutes, but instead of calming down, Ethan doubled down on his behavior. By the end of the night, he was handcuffed and sitting in the back of a police car, still yelling about how no one treats a Caldwell this way. Next morning, Ethan woke up in a holding cell, disoriented and angry. How had things gone so wrong? Surely this was all a big misunderstanding. Once his lawyer showed up, Ethan relaxed, convinced that his father's influence would fix everything. After all, hadn't it always worked before? As he prepared for court, Ethan smirked, already imagining the judge dismissing the charges after hearing his family name. Little did he know, this time would be different. This time, he was about to meet someone who didn't care about money or power, someone whose sense of justice couldn't be bought or intimidated, and that meeting would change everything, for both of them. Judge Margaret Hayes was not someone you forgot easily. At 62 years old, she carried herself with a quiet strength that commanded respect without demanding it. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her calm demeanor masked a razor-sharp mind. For over 30 years, Judge Hayes had presided over countless cases, earning a reputation for fairness and integrity. She wasn't just another figure in a black robe. She was a force to be reckoned with. Born into a modest family, Margaret grew up understanding the value of hard work and honesty. Her father worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, while her mother stitched clothes late into the night to make ends meet. From an early age, Margaret learned that life wasn't fair, but also that justice didn't have to depend on wealth or connections. This belief shaped her career choice. After graduating at the top of her law school class, she dedicated herself to serving the community, working tirelessly to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, received a fair hearing. Over the decades, Judge Hayes became known as the people's judge. Unlike some of her peers who let politics or personal biases sway their decisions, Margaret stuck to one guiding principle. The law applied equally to all. Whether the defendant was a struggling single mother or a millionaire CEO, she listened, carefully weighed the evidence, and delivered verdicts based solely on facts. It wasn't uncommon for high-profile attorneys to try bribing her or intimidating her, but they always failed. Margaret Hayes didn't bend under pressure. When Ethan Caldwell's file landed on her desk, Judge Hayes took notice immediately. As she reviewed the details, she saw a familiar pattern. Reckless driving charges dropped due to technical errors. Assault allegations swept under the rug after private settlements. A string of offenses, each conveniently erased before it could tarnish the Caldwell name. To anyone else, this might have seemed like bad luck or coincidence. But Margaret knew better. These were the privileges of power, the kind of favoritism she despised. The more she read, the firmer her resolve became. This case wasn't just about Ethan, it was about sending a message. Too often, people like him slipped through the cracks of the justice system protected by money and influence. If left unchecked, such behavior only reinforced the idea that laws existed for some, but not others. Margaret refused to let that happen on her watch. On the morning of the trial, Judge Hayes arrived early, sipping coffee as she went over her notes one last time. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters jotted down observations. Curious spectators whispered among themselves, and Ethan sat confidently beside his lawyer, flashing smug smiles. None of them realized what awaited them. Margaret Hayes wasn't there to entertain theatrics or bow to intimidation. She was there to uphold the law, and she intended to do exactly that. As the proceedings began, Judge Hayes adjusted her glasses and scanned the room. Her presence alone seemed to silence the murmurs. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear, setting the tone for what would become a pivotal moment, not just for Ethan Caldwell, but for everyone watching. Justice, she reminded herself, wasn't blind because it ignored differences. It was blind because it treated everyone the same. And today that included the arrogant young man sitting across from her. The courtroom was tense as Ethan Caldwell strolled in, his expensive suit catching the light with every confident step. He carried himself like someone who already knew the outcome of the trial. Guilty or not, he believed he'd walk away unscathed. His lawyer, a well-known figure in high-profile cases, sat beside him, flipping through papers with practiced ease. But Ethan barely paid attention. Instead, he glanced around the room, smirking at the reporters scribbling notes and ignoring the prosecutor entirely. When Judge Hayes entered, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter died down instantly, replaced by an almost palpable silence. Everyone rose as she took her seat, her presence commanding respect even before she spoke. Her eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on Ethan. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Ethan felt something unusual, a flicker of unease. It was fleeting, though, and he quickly dismissed it. After all, what could this judge possibly do to him? The proceedings began, and the prosecutor laid out the case against Ethan. Witnesses were called: the nightclub bouncer who had been shoved, a staff member who heard Ethan's threats, and even a patron who recorded part of the altercation on their phone. Each testimony painted a damning picture of Ethan's behavior that night. Yet, instead of paying attention, Ethan leaned back in his chair, rolling his eyes and whispering sarcastic comments to his lawyer. To him, none of this mattered. People said things under oath all the time, but words didn't hold weight unless the person speaking them had power, and these witnesses clearly didn't. Finally, it was Ethan's turn to speak. His lawyer nudged him forward, reminding him to stay composed, but Ethan waved him off. This was child's play. He didn't need coaching. Standing up, he adjusted his tie and flashed what he thought was a charming smile. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with confidence, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here." He paused dramatically, letting the words hang in the air. When no one interrupted, he continued. "My father, Richard Caldwell, is a close friend of Mayor Thompson. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He's done so much for this city." Ethan let the implication linger, glancing at Judge Hayes, as if expecting her to nod in agreement, but her expression remained unreadable. Encouraged by her silence, he pressed on. "Given the circumstances, I believe we can resolve this without wasting anyone's time. A fine, maybe community service? Something simple, really. No need to make a big deal out of this." The gallery murmured, some people shaking their heads while others exchanged knowing looks. Even the prosecutor seemed taken aback by Ethan's blatant attempt to throw his family name around. But Judge Hayes didn't react immediately. She simply stared at him, her hands folded neatly on the bench. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she leaned forward slightly. Her voice, when it came, was calm but firm, like steel wrapped in velvet. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, enunciating each word carefully, "in my courtroom, your father's name means nothing." The room fell silent again, the weight of her statement sinking in. Ethan froze, his smirk faltering for the first time. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Surely she couldn't mean that. Everyone cared about his father's name. It opened doors, smoothed over problems, made inconvenient truths disappear. How could this judge possibly be immune? But Judge Hayes wasn't finished. "You are here because of your actions, not your family connections, and those actions will be judged based on the law. Not privilege, not influence, and certainly not intimidation." Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. For the first time in his life, he realized that his usual tactics might not work. The arrogance he wore like armor suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. As he sank back into his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone, the courtroom seemed different somehow. The reporters' pens moved faster, the spectators leaned forward, and Judge Hayes sat tall, radiating authority. Whatever happened next, Ethan understood one thing. This wasn't going to go the way he planned. The courtroom was quiet now, the kind of silence that pressed against everyone's ears. Ethan sat stiffly in his chair, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time in his life, he felt small and exposed. Judge Hayes's words echoed in his mind. "In my courtroom, your father's name means nothing." It was a sentence he couldn't unhear, one that stripped away the shield he'd relied on for as long as he could remember. Judge Hayes wasted no time moving forward with the trial. She called the next witness to the stand, a young woman who had been working at the nightclub that night. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted how Ethan shoved the bouncer and shouted threats about ruining people's lives. "He kept saying things like, 'You don't know who I am,'" she said, glancing nervously at Ethan. "It was scary." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wanted to interrupt, to tell her she was exaggerating or lying, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Judge Hayes watched him, her gaze steady and unyielding. Or maybe it was the realization that his usual tactics wouldn't work here. Whatever it was, he stayed silent, staring at the floor instead. Next came the security footage. The prosecutor dimmed the lights and played the video on a large screen mounted near the jury box. There was Ethan, clear as day, shoving the bouncer and pointing aggressively. His face was red, his gestures wild. Even Ethan himself winced when he saw it. On camera, he didn't look powerful or untouchable. He looked angry, reckless, and out of control. When the lights came back on, Judge Hayes spoke again. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, addressing him directly, "do you have anything to say regarding this evidence?" Ethan hesitated. His lawyer nudged him gently, urging him to respond. Slowly, Ethan stood up, trying to summon some of his earlier bravado. He cleared his throat, straightening his tie as if adjusting it would give him confidence. "Look, Your Honor, I admit I might have lost my temper that night, but come on. It was just a little misunderstanding. People get into arguments all the time. Does that really deserve all this attention?" His tone was almost pleading now, lacking the arrogance from before. He even managed a weak smile, hoping to charm the judge. But Judge Hayes didn't soften. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench. "A little misunderstanding, Mr. Caldwell?" she repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Is that what you call threatening someone's livelihood? Is that what you call putting others in danger because you couldn't control your anger?" Ethan flinched, sinking back into his seat. The room seemed smaller now, closing in around him. He glanced at his lawyer, silently begging for help, but even the lawyer avoided meeting his eyes. Judge Hayes continued, her voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "I've seen too many cases like yours, Mr. Caldwell. Wealthy individuals who believe they're above the law. They break rules, harm others, and walk away without consequence because their families pull strings. But let me make one thing very clear. That stops today. This courtroom is not a place for privilege or intimidation. It's a place for justice. As she spoke, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not quite guilt, but the beginning of understanding. For years, he'd taken advantage of his family name, using it to bulldoze through obstacles and escape responsibility. Now, for the first time, he faced the truth. His actions had consequences whether he liked it or not. The final witness finished testifying, and Judge Hayes adjourned the court briefly to review the case. When she returned, her expression gave nothing away. Ethan fidgeted in his seat, his earlier bravado completely gone. As the judge prepared to deliver her verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone waited, breaths held, wondering what would happen next. For Ethan Caldwell, the lesson was just beginning, and it wasn't going to be easy. The moment of truth arrived as Judge Hayes adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Ethan. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. Everyone leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting for her decision. Even Ethan, who had spent most of the trial rolling his eyes or smirking, now sat perfectly still. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white as if bracing himself for impact. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Hayes began, her voice steady and deliberate. "After reviewing the evidence presented today, the testimonies, the security, footage, and your own statements, I find you guilty on all charges." She paused, letting the words sink in. Ethan's jaw dropped slightly, but he didn't interrupt. For once, he seemed too stunned to speak. "Reckless driving, assault, and disorderly conduct are serious offenses," she continued. "Your actions that night endangered others and demonstrated a complete disregard for the law and the safety of those around you. This court cannot, and will not, excuse such behavior simply because of who your father is." Ethan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him, scribbling notes furiously, but there was no mistaking the finality in Judge Hayes's tone. She wasn't negotiating, she was sentencing. "For these crimes," she announced, "you are hereby sentenced to 6 months in county jail, followed by 200 hours of community service. Additionally, you will attend mandatory anger management classes and submit to regular check-ins with a probation officer upon your release." Gasps rippled through the gallery. 6 months in jail? For someone like Ethan who had never faced real consequences before, this was unimaginable. He shot to his feet, his face flushed with panic. "Your Honor, please," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. Do you even know who I am?" Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she replied coolly. "I know exactly who you are, and right now, you're just another citizen standing before the law. No more, no less." Her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. For the first time in his life, he realized how powerless he truly was. All the money, connections, and influence his family wielded couldn't save him here. Not in this courtroom. Not with this judge. As 2 bailiffs approached to take him into custody, Ethan stumbled back, his expensive suit suddenly feeling suffocating. "This isn't fair," he shouted, his voice rising hysterically. "You'll regret this. My father will—" "That's enough, Mr. Caldwell," Judge Hayes interrupted sharply. "Your threats carry no weight here. Court is adjourned." With that, she banged her gavel, signaling the end of the trial. The room erupted in whispers. As the bailiffs led Ethan away, reporters scrambled to document the scene, snapping photos and jotting down quotes. Meanwhile, Ethan struggled against the officers, his protests growing louder until they faded down the hallway. Later that evening, news outlets buzzed with headlines about the fallen heir. Social media lit up with reactions ranging from outrage to applause. Some criticized Judge Hayes for being too harsh, arguing that Ethan deserved a second chance without jail time. Others praised her for standing firm against privilege, calling her ruling a victory for fairness. Memes mocking Ethan's meltdown flooded online platforms, turning the incident into both a cautionary tale and a source of entertainment. Meanwhile, Ethan's family swung into action. Richard Caldwell made phone calls, pulling every string he could think of to overturn the verdict. He reached out to politicians, lawyers, and influential friends demanding answers. But Judge Hayes's ruling held strong. Her reputation for integrity preceded her, and no one dared interfere. As for Ethan, his first night in jail was a rude awakening. Stripped of his designer clothes and handed an orange jumpsuit, he felt utterly humiliated. The other inmates sized him up immediately, their stares burning holes into his skin. For years he'd walked through life expecting people to bow to him. Now, locked behind bars, he was just another face in the crowd, one that no one cared about. Lying on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, Ethan replayed the day's events over and over in his mind. He thought about Judge Hayes's words, "No more, no less." For the first time, he began to understand what it meant to be held accountable, not as a Caldwell, but as a person. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but perhaps, deep down, it was exactly what he needed. Life behind bars was nothing like Ethan had imagined. Growing up, he'd heard stories about jail, how tough it could be, but those tales always seemed distant, almost mythical. After all, people like him didn't end up in places like this, or so he thought. Now, as the heavy metal door clanged shut each night, Ethan realized just how wrong he'd been. The first few days were the hardest. The food was bland and tasteless, served on a plastic tray that reminded him of school cafeterias, but worse. His cellmate, a burly man named Derek with tattoos covering his arms, didn't say much at first. Instead, he watched Ethan closely, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. Ethan tried to act tough, puffing out his chest and avoiding eye contact, but Derek saw right through him. "You're not cut out for this place," Derek said one evening, shaking his head. Not yet, anyway. Ethan hated being talked down to, but he couldn't argue. Everything about prison felt foreign and suffocating. He missed his soft bed, his tailored suits, and the freedom to do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. Most of all, he missed the respect, or rather the fear, that his family name once commanded. Here, no one cared who Richard Caldwell was. If anything, mentioning his father's wealth only made things worse. Other inmates mocked him, calling him rich boy, and laughing when he complained about the conditions. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort or teasing that got to Ethan, it was the loneliness. For the first time in his life, he had no one to bail him out, no one to smooth things over. His lawyer visited occasionally, bringing updates about failed appeals, but even those conversations felt hollow. Back home, his father worked tirelessly to overturn the sentence, but Judge Hayes's ruling remained ironclad. Slowly, Ethan began to understand what it meant to face the consequences of his actions, not because of privilege, but because of fairness. Things started to change during his community service assignment. After serving 3 months in jail, Ethan was allowed to transition into supervised volunteer work. His task? Helping at a local youth center for underprivileged kids. At first, Ethan resented it. Cleaning up graffiti-covered walls and organizing old books wasn't exactly glamorous, but then he met Marcus. Marcus was a former gang member turned mentor who ran the center. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried both authority and kindness, Marcus commanded respect without raising his hand or his voice. One afternoon, while painting a mural together, Marcus struck up a conversation with Ethan. "So, what brings you here?" he asked casually, dipping his brush into a bucket of blue paint. Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I messed up," he admitted finally. "Big time." Marcus nodded knowingly. "We've all been there, kid. Difference is, some of us learn from it." Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself opening up to Marcus more than he ever expected. They talked about growing up, making mistakes, and finding purpose. Marcus shared his own story, how he'd grown up poor, gotten involved with gangs, and landed in prison multiple times before turning his life around. "It's easy to think the world owes you something," Marcus said one day. "But real strength comes from owning your choices and doing better next time." For Ethan, these conversations planted seeds of reflection. He began to see parallels Between his behavior and the struggles of the kids at the center, many of whom came from broken homes or faced challenges far greater than anything he'd experienced. Their resilience inspired him, and for the first time he felt a flicker of gratitude for the second chance he'd been given and for the lessons he was learning, however painful they might be. By the time his community service ended, Ethan wasn't the same person who had walked into court months earlier. Humble and reflective, he wrote a heartfelt letter to Judge Hayes thanking her for holding him accountable. Though skeptical, she acknowledged his effort as genuine, a small step toward redemption. Back home, Ethan knew his journey wasn't over, but for the first time he felt ready to take responsibility, not just for his past, but for shaping a better future. When Ethan completed his sentence and walked out of the courthouse as a free man, he didn't feel like celebrating. Instead, he felt different. The months in jail, the community service, and the conversations with Marcus had left a mark on him. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't thinking about how to get ahead or how to use his family name to fix things. He was thinking about what came next and how he could make it count. The first thing Ethan did after leaving the courthouse was visit Marcus at the youth center. It wasn't planned. Something inside him just pulled him there. When Marcus saw Ethan walk in, he raised an eyebrow but smiled warmly. "Back already?" he teased, setting down a stack of flyers he'd been organizing. "I wanted to say thank you," Ethan said simply, his voice steady but sincere. "You helped me see things I never would have noticed on my own." Marcus chuckled, leaning against the table. "I didn't do much, kid. You're the one who decided to listen." Ethan shook his head. "No, you did more than you know. You showed me that people can change if they want to, and I want to." That conversation sparked an idea in Ethan's mind. Over the next few weeks, he began spending more time at the center, helping wherever he could. At first, he stuck to simple tasks, cleaning up, sorting supplies, or playing basketball with the kids. But as he got to know them better, he realized how much they struggled. Many came from homes without enough food or parents working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Some had dreams of becoming artists, athletes, or engineers, but no resources to turn those dreams into reality. Ethan knew he couldn't solve all their problems, but he could try to help. Using his family's connections for good this time, he reached out to local businesses and charities, asking for donations and partnerships. His father, Richard Caldwell, initially resisted the idea, still angry about the trial and its fallout. But when Ethan explained his vision, not just helping the center but reforming parts of the justice system, he reluctantly agreed to support him. With funding secured, Ethan launched a series of programs aimed at giving underprivileged youth opportunities they otherwise wouldn't have. There were workshops on career planning, mentorship sessions with professionals, and even scholarships for college-bound students. The youth center became a hub of hope and possibility, thanks largely to Ethan's efforts. But Ethan didn't stop there. Inspired by Judge Hayes' unwavering commitment to fairness, he also started advocating for changes in the legal system. He gave interviews, attended panel discussions, and worked with lawmakers to address issues like inequality in sentencing and access to quality legal representation. People were skeptical at first. After all, this was the same Ethan Caldwell, who had once tried to intimidate a judge, but his sincerity won them over. During this period of transformation, Ethan wrote another letter to Judge Hayes. This one was longer, more personal. He apologized again for his behavior during the trial, and thanked her not just for holding him accountable but for showing him the importance of humility and responsibility. "You taught me that true strength comes from owning your mistakes and using them to grow," he wrote. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to that lesson." To Ethan's surprise, Judge Hayes responded. Her reply was brief but meaningful. "Change is hard, Mr. Caldwell, but it's also powerful. Keep going." As months turned into years, Ethan continued his work, earning respect rather than envy from those around him. He wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes, but he faced them head-on, determined to learn and improve. The arrogant young man who had once believed the world revolved around him was gone. In his place stood someone humbler, wiser, and more grounded. And while Ethan's journey wasn't easy, it was worth it. Every child whose life he touched, every policy he helped reform, reminded him of why he'd chosen this path. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was making a real difference, not because of his last name, but because of the person he'd become. Years passed, and Ethan Caldwell's name began to mean something entirely different in the city. No longer was he known as the reckless rich kid who thought rules didn't apply to him. Now, people spoke of him with admiration, not because of his wealth or family connections, but because of the positive impact he'd made on the community. His transformation wasn't just personal, it was public, visible, and inspiring. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan found himself standing outside the courthouse where his life had changed forever. Clutching a small envelope in his hand, he took a deep breath before walking inside. The building looked exactly the same: marble floors, high ceilings, and that unmistakable air of authority. But for Ethan, it felt like an entirely different place. This time, he wasn't there to argue or protest. He was there to thank the woman who had set him on this path. Judge Margaret Hayes had retired 2 years earlier after decades of dedicated service. Her chambers were now occupied by another judge, but her legacy lived on in every corner of the courthouse. When Ethan asked if he could meet her at her home, she agreed, curious about what he wanted. The next day, Ethan arrived at Judge Hayes's modest house on the outskirts of the city. She greeted him warmly, though her sharp eyes still carried that familiar spark of scrutiny. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, extending her hand. "This is unexpected." Ethan shook her hand firmly, feeling a mix of nerves and gratitude. "Your Honor, I know my visit might come as a surprise, but I needed to see you in person, to say thank you properly." They sat down in her cozy living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time, Ethan noticed how simple yet elegant her surroundings were. There were no grand chandeliers or expensive furnishings, just books lining the shelves and family photos on the walls. It suited her perfectly. "I owe you more than I can ever express," Ethan began, pulling out the letter he'd written. "You held me accountable when no one else would. You showed me that justice isn't about power or privilege, it's about fairness and integrity. And because of that, I've been able to turn my life around." Judge Hayes listened intently, her expression softening slightly. When Ethan finished speaking, she nodded thoughtfully. "Change is never easy, Mr. Caldwell. What you've done since that trial speaks volumes about your character. But remember, true success isn't measured by accolades or recognition. It's measured by the lives you touch and the values you uphold." Ethan smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "I'll keep that in mind, Your Honor. Thank you for everything." As Ethan left Judge Hayes's home, he felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying had finally lifted. Over the years, he had rebuilt his reputation, not by chasing fame or fortune, but by staying true to the lessons he'd learned. He continued working tirelessly to support underprivileged youth and advocate for justice reform, becoming a voice for those who often went unheard. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes watched from afar, quietly proud of the man Ethan had become. Though she rarely discussed the case with others, she often reflected on it privately. To her, Ethan's journey was proof that even the most stubborn hearts could change when given the chance and the right push. The story of Ethan Caldwell became a symbol of redemption and accountability. Schools invited him to speak to students about making better choices, while organizations sought his guidance on creating equitable opportunities. Yet despite his growing influence, Ethan remained humble. He knew his past mistakes couldn't be erased, but he also knew they didn't define him anymore. In the end, Ethan's transformation wasn't just about him. It was about the countless lives he touched along the way, the kids who dreamed bigger because of his programs, the families who found hope through his advocacy, and the judges like Margaret Hayes who reminded everyone that justice should always stand above privilege. And so, what had started as a courtroom confrontation became a story of growth, humility, and second chances, a testament to the fact that, no matter where you start, it's never too late to choose a better path.